Hello and welcome to episode 7 of my mostly stock career. Almost forgot the number there for a second. But today we're going to be working on some stuff. I had originally planned to be going to Minmus today and doing some temperature scans as well as maybe a landing. However, I don't think technologically we're quite ready for that. So instead we're going to position some satellites in orbit around Kerbin. Now I'm just looking at between the two and going to pick the one with the higher reward, which appears to be this one right here. So we're going to get over 150,000 just from this one little satellite. And science data from around Kerbin, we're going to grab this because we're just going to put like a thermometer on it and transmit it back with the satellite launch. So it probably would have been intelligent to, before jumping in the VAB, check what we're actually orbiting. Like, what is our orbit, I mean. So let's go to the tracking station and check this out. There are two. Let's see. Launch a satellite into a specific orbit. Yeah, but let's see, okay. Fluid Dynamics Research Labs is the outside one. And Moving Parts Agency Group. I assume because this one is yellow or like greenish, the inside one is the one we're doing. But Moving Parts Group is the one I think we're doing. So let's go back and check that. Active. Yep, Moving Parts Expert Group. So it is the inside one. Which means that a mild incline on the orbit shouldn't be too hard to do. If we, of course, wait for our launch window so that the Kerbal Space Center, which is positioned right about here, which is right here, if we wait for that to be in line with the periapsis or apoapsis, or basically this axis right here, lined up with this axis, then we'll be able to launch straight into the orbit and we won't have to do any plane corrections. So I guess we'll wait for that, but we actually need to create a rocket. Now, it's further out than the moon, so we're going to have to take our normal amount of delta V to get into orbit, and then a little bit more than what it actually takes to get to the moon. So we have to keep that in mind when creating it. So that's going to be about 5,000 roughly to get into that orbit. Not to really account for how much it may take additionally to correct that orbit. So how about I design something really quick for that? Alright, so what I've managed to put here is actually a really good example of why you don't need a large craft to get a lot of delta V. So inside this fairing, we have the probe, which needs to be able to generate power from the solar panels and have an antenna, which you see there. And then I have my thermometer, which is going to be that science experiment I'll be doing. And all it has is 2 of these small fuel tanks and a small spark liquid engine, and that's the probe. It's very small, very simple, and it's going to work. Plus it has almost 3,000 delta V by itself, with the little tiny engine and the 3 tiny fuel tanks. Sorry, there are 3 there, as well as a battery. And then of course I have this kind of get into orbit stage, and then the little kicker stage, which is really small. So all in all, this is a very small rocket, only about 10 tons, and it has enough delta V to get this probe into almost anywhere. Not almost anywhere, but actually, yeah, almost anywhere in the Kerbin system. It might actually have enough to escape it. However, I'm not going to focus on escaping, or really trying to, but this should be a good short-range probe for rather close orbits, basically in between Minmus and the moon for orbits. So let's launch this thing. Alright, so we're here on the launch pad, and there's just something we need to do first, and that is actually determine our orbit, and it appears to be this one right here. So I don't think we can target the orbit. No, we can't. So I'm wondering if this would be easier to try and launch on the node. What I mean by that is try to launch at the angle that it's at, or if it would be better to just try and attempt to basically get in a normal orbit and then worry about this. Actually, yeah, we'll just do that. We won't try to launch to orbit just yet. We'll do this the easier way. We'll get into a normal orbit. Make sure that we're going the right way. So if we zoom out, we can see that these little dots are moving in a counterclockwise or anti-clockwise pattern, which is the standard orbit. You do want to check this beforehand. If you don't, then you could really kind of screw yourself over, needing another like 1500 to 2000 delta V just to reverse the orientation of the orbit. So just by zooming out a little, you can see these dots, which make it easy to see. And then you know which way it's going. So let's just launch to a standard orbit, and then we'll basically rendezvous into that orbit. I believe that will be an easier method. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about actual rocket launches and in relation to the gravity turn. Now, it's more efficient and it's a better idea to do a gradual gravity turn, meaning you start at 90 degrees and then you gradually turn to be 0 degrees over the horizon. And the reason it's more efficient to do this is because when you're closer to Kerbin, you're affected by gravity much, much more, meaning it's more efficient to get further away from Kerbin faster when Kerbin's gravity is strong. And then once you've gotten a certain distance away from Kerbin and the gravity becomes weaker, then it becomes more efficient to go in both directions at one time, meaning at about a 45-degree angle. And the reason this is because gravity in Kerbal Space Program is actually calculated the same way it is in real life, which is mass of object 1 plus mass of object 2 divided by the distance squared. And if you were to say that the distance squared was 1, just say 1 meter, which we'll assume is just at sea level, because if you divide by 0, then the Kraken attacks. But 1 meter, then you can assume that 9.81, or just 9.8, or even 10 if you want to round it up, is the distance, or the masses between them. And then you divide it by 1, you're still going to have that. Now, if you double your distance, so that your gravity is 9, we'll just go with 10 because it's easier to calculate. If you go with 10, and then you double your distance, then that 10 becomes a 5. Now, this isn't the case because the mass of the two objects are actually much, much different, but because it's squared, it's gradual, meaning that when you're 1 meter away, you're dividing by 1, because 1 times 1 is 1. When you're 2 meters away, you're dividing by 4, because 2 times 2 is 4. When you're a kilometer away, which is 1,000, then it's 1,000 times 1,000, which you're then dividing by, I want to say, 1,000,000. So because the distance is squared, the further you get away, the more gravity begins to, or the less, significantly less gravity begins to affect you. Meaning that first kilometer is a huge amount of actual gravity that you have to force yourself to lift off against. Which is another reason that as you get further away from the planet, you actually begin to accelerate faster, because not only are you burning fuel and your mass is going down on your ships, your thrust-to-weight ratio is going up, but at the same time, gravity is affecting you less, meaning your surface thrust-to-weight ratio is actually going up the further you get away, because gravity has less of an effect. So now that we have achieved our orbit, it's time to create our maneuver node for actually getting into this particular one. Now, what I'm thinking about doing is, to be honest, I don't think it matters, but we're going to go to the apoapsis first, and then we'll bring our periapsis up. So what you're going to want to do is, in order to actually get to your target orbit, you're going to want to line the apoapsis in the middle of Kerbin, and then click on your orbit path right behind the apoapsis. That way it's all lined up. And then you're just going to want to go, of course, at this point, not necessarily the apoapsis, I should state, but the ascending node, because ascending or descending node, I keep forgetting this, they're not the same thing. Because the ascending or descending node is when, this moment is when our orbit is aligned with the target orbit. So by adding a maneuver node here, what we do is we can literally just burn prograde, and we can reach our targeted orbit. Now we don't need to worry about that lunar encounter because we're not actually going to be coming back. So if you see, just by burning prograde, we actually reach this descending node right here. And when we get to that descending node, that is when we're going to use another maneuver node to actually complete this orbit. So for now, we'll keep it to just one node. That's close enough aligned for now. So we'll only worry about this one. And we'll do the second node later. So we'll just time accelerate. We actually launched to a pretty solid encounter with that other piece of debris, but it's not like it really affects us anymore. Now, as far as I know, I don't have Kerbal Engineer up, so I can't exactly tell by myself, but I think that my second stage has less thrust to weight ratio, meaning that the burn time would take much longer. So I'm actually going to start the burn at about 40 seconds instead of actually waiting until about 15 seconds to start it, because I do want the extra time in case, of course, my thrust to weight ratio is so significantly less. Since, of course, we're going to run out of delta V in this stage. So how about we go now? We'll burn off all of this delta V, and then we'll stage. And actually, it's doing surprisingly well, so we're actually going to wait a little bit. Just because we don't want to be too off with the node. This stage actually has a pretty solid thrust to weight ratio, which I'm pretty impressed with. Which means it's going to burn through the fuel pretty quickly. However, it's also going to give us a very large change quite quickly. So we're going to be through 1/3 of our fuel rather soon. And I think it's just going to take a little bit more than 1/3 to actually complete the node. So, woo, that's a lot of control. Basically what this means is that we get about 600 delta V. I'm actually going to toggle the torque on my reaction wheel because it's a little too much for me to handle right now. Alright, so we got our periapsis, or sorry, our apoapsis way up here. It's not the best aligned, but it'll be okay. Let's actually add a maneuver right there and fix it, which is just going to require us to slow down very, very minimally. And that will actually make it much more accurate. So of course, once you finish your main drive burn that pulls you out, your orbit way out, you can create a secondary node to kind of correct any small mistakes that are in it. Such as with this one. Now, the orbits don't have to be perfect, but they do have to be pretty close. There we go. Our correction is good. Now, like I said, they don't have to be perfect, but they do have to be pretty close. So, once you actually get your apoapsis and the descending or ascending node, either one of these two work, then you want to click where they meet, or the closest point that they meet, which should be about here, and add a maneuver node. And then what you're going to want to do is pull this maneuver node out until, of course, you nearly mimic the other orbit. But you'll notice that the other orbit is significantly different. So the reason we do the ascending nodes is because if you look when I burn normal, which is basically burning toward the north pole of Kerbin, my orbit actually allows me to align itself. And this will only occur at the ascending or descending node, that you can actually align your orbit using this method. So we'll just use these two nodes, anti-normal and normal, which are the purple nodes, until our orbits are pretty much on the same axis. And then, now that they're on the same axis, we can pull this back and almost align it. Now, when we pulled the retrograde node, we de-aligned the axes. So again, we just have to play a little bit more by ear and kind of tweak these two until they're aligned again. And then you'll notice we're not quite aligned on the orbit, so of course we repeat. Now at this point with the maneuver node, you'll notice down here my predicted orbit is below the required orbit, and up here my predicted orbit is below the required orbit. Meaning, because it starts dropping down over here, what we need to do is burn away from the planet. What that is going to do is burning away from the planet, this radial out node, the blue one with the lines on the outside, it's going to cause this line over here to lift up. So if you watch, you can see that the line is lifting up. And it's also going to cause the line down here to lift up. So now we've aligned these nodes, and you can see our apoapsis or our periapsis is actually above that periapsis. So again, we're doing more tweaking. So we're just going to slow down a little bit. That was a little too much. Until, of course, our apoapsis and periapsis align. So now you can see our predicted orbit and our required orbit are almost identical, and I believe that this should be identical enough for this burn to work. So just by tweaking the nodes and knowing how the orbital mechanics work, all is good. And of course, now that I zoomed in, I see a little bit more discrepancy between the two. So I'm just gonna fix that. It should be fine. We will see how it works when we actually do the burn. If it says it's good enough, then it's good enough. If not, we'll have to do a minor correction. But once we get to the node, we will see. And I accidentally, just trying to zoom in, pulled one of these things around. Looks like it was the radial. So we'll just bring that back up. There we go. All is good. Let's try not to do that again. Or right-click on the node to minimize it so we can't actually edit it anymore. Now, if you didn't know, you can use the mouse wheel for very fine-tuning of your orbits. So that is an option, which is what actually happened there, although it was unintentional that time. So we actually went past the maneuver node a little bit. Shouldn't hurt us too much, since we'll still be able to do the burn pretty accurately. And of course, you can watch our orbit. It's now aligned itself, and it's just kind of spreading out. Of course, we're going to take the node nice and slow as to get it as accurately as possible. There we go, that node is done. And did we achieve it? Maintained stability for 10 seconds, there we go. It gave it to us. Which means our orbit was accurate enough. So of course we get 120,000 funds, which I can't argue with. And now we have this nice satellite here. So let's actually name this thing. Rename vessel, we'll just call this Sat1, we'll call it a probe, say OK, and let's do that science. Log temperature. Oh, apparently we haven't done a temperature scan high over Kerbin. Ah well, we'll transmit it now. And we should have completed that second contract, which we did. So we can discard of that, and we've launched a probe into space around Kerbin. So let's go back to the Space Center, now that that contract is done, and see if we can't find any more on Kerbin. Or, I mean, in this place, if I could say it. Mission Control. Ooh, this is one I was actually looking for. Build a new orbital station around Kerbin. This one should be fun. Let's see, what does this thing need? Put your station in orbit of Kerbin. Alright. I didn't know creating an orbital station around Kerbin required you to put it in orbit, but I suppose it's nice that it explicitly states that. build a new station that has antenna, docking port, and generates power, have a facility supporting at least 10 Kerbals, that's quite a few, have a research lab at the station, have 4,000 units of liquid fuel, and maintain stability for 10 seconds. 4,000 units of liquid fuel, that's actually a lot of liquid fuel to launch. It'd take a couple refuelings. That's 2 orange tanks worth of liquid fuel, and we don't even have 1 orange tank. So that is quite a heavy lifter that would require to move that much fuel. I'm not sure if that one's necessarily going to be worth it, since we don't have any super large tanks or super large engines. It'll be kind of difficult to haul around 4,000 units of liquid fuel, since we also can't mine it. We were planning on doing a mission to Minmus, so science data from Minmus. That one would be nice to have. However, before we go to Minmus, I did want one last piece of science, and that science was actually the solar panel tech, because I wanted to be able to do a full scientific laboratory, so I could maximize my science that I'll be getting from Minmus. However, we'll have to do that in the future, because we are at the end of this episode. Thank you guys for watching. This is PTT GRW, signing out.